Here we go.
Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your Friday afternoon for this presentation. It's exciting to see this many people. The whole webinar thing is still not something that I do a ton, so it's weird not to have an audience to play off of. So hopefully Melissa is going to laugh tons whenever I say anything funny to keep me motivated and keep me going. There, she passed the first test. There we
I'm
go.
on it.
Okay, so how do I go down to my next slide?
Oh, we need to make it big. There we go.
Okay, great. All right, so we're going to start off with a little bit of a book club stuff. So we're not just going to talk about brain injury. We want to make this more exciting. So in addition to being a doctor and physician here in Oregon, I also own part of the business. So I'm a businessman, so I decided I was going to be really good and read business books this summer. So these are kind of two of the classics for those of you who are at all interested. This Built to Last and Good to Great. They tell about how these companies have been fantastic over time or how they made themselves great over time. And these are really looked upon as like the great texts and that everybody uses and talks about at seminars. And these authors have been famous and made millions of dollars. And then after I was done with these two books, I read this book, The Halo Effect, and found out that basically everything that those authors were talking about, those other books, was BS because it was all based upon this halo effect. So if you take and look at something great or a great company, the halo effect is defined as we assume that just because people are good at doing A, they will be good at doing B, C, and D. So this came about from a psychologist, Edward Thorndike, who looked at reports that commanding officers on soldiers around World War One, and he would grade when people got graded. They got graded on they would do either everything well or they did everything poorly. So that's where this whole premise of the halo effect came at. So it's really interesting. So one of the things they did was they looked at there was a study where they had groups of people pick stocks and see how those stocks performed. And then they would tell them how the stocks did. And then retrospectively, people would talk about how they worked together as a group. And the funny thing about it was, so they tell them how the stock performs, and the people who did really well with the stocks talked about how well their group performed together and how great of team players they were. And the people whose stocks didn't do very well, they would talk about how one person dominated the group, or it just wasn't a cohesive group, or there wasn't good teamwork. But actually, the person leading the study didn't tell them the truth about how the stocks performed. So regardless of how their stocks actually performed, if people thought they did well, they remembered it as a really great team building experience. And if their stocks, if they thought they did poorly, they didn't think it was such a good experience. So interesting, and obviously goes kind of along this whole brain thing. Halo effect, also what they were looking at is this delusion of correlation and causality, delusion of the single explanation. Businesses don't just do well because of one thing. And then the delusion of absolute performance. Everybody picks on Kmart, right? So it's one of the most interesting things. Kmart gets ripped on for doing so poorly during the 90s and 2000s, and that's why they've died away. But if you look at their performance, they actually did really well. They just didn't do as well as Walmart and Target. So they're looked upon as failing, but they just weren't quite as good as those other groups. So again, interesting stuff. So the next book I read was Friction. So this one I was pretty excited about because friction is defined as the difference between the way things are and the way they should be. So essentially, Uber is what you look at. Everything in the world should be like Uber, right? There's an app, press a button, that's all you have to do. But then I got horribly disappointed because this guy or these authors were talking about some other effects or other things, and it was clearly a halo effect. So they should have read the other book before they started. So I was a little disappointed in that. But some of the things that I learned from that book was, did I waste my time when I got to that? Well, no, because one of the number one things I learned is that PowerPoint presentations are really terrible at getting information across. And I'm sure many of you know that. In fact, after researching the Columbia shuttle disaster, when NASA had the information on the tiles being torn off and what they should do with it, but no one did the right thing, they forbid PowerPoint presentations after that because the message was buried deep in this presentation that no one was paying attention to. So you can't listen and read. That's another thing, is we put these slides up and we're trying to read the slides while we listen to what the person's saying. That actually doesn't work so well. And then I know anybody who's looking at their phone right now, you're done. once you pick up your phone, I've lost you. So you probably should just go ahead and stop listening. There's one person there that might have already turned on.
Oh no, they got on. Somebody else got on.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. We went 1 for 1 then.
Awesome.
So
no Facebook either.
How do I get you to pay attention for this? So I was thinking of doing a presentation just solely based upon different emoji, but there's not enough of them. Interpretive dance does not work in this setting. Stories are the best way to tell our information. So we'll try and weave together some stories. So for me, I started out 30 years ago, which is hard to believe. And I was actually a student athletic trainer at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, covering the football team. And 30 years ago, concussions were not really talked about a lot. I can actually remember only one athlete having a concussion that year. And we probably are past the statute of limitations, but I still probably shouldn't break HIPAA laws because it's kind of would be an interesting story because he was well known for a while, but I won't go into the details. But it really was a minimal issue. As athletic training students, we certainly learned about it. We talked about kind of how we went through a return to play process, which was incredibly simple, but we really didn't talk at all about the academic implications or other implications of the injury. 10 years later, I was a pediatric resident at the University of Washington, and that was a point where there was the emerging recognition of what was then described as second impact syndrome, where an athlete would have a concussion, perhaps come back to play too soon or continue to play while still symptomatic, and then suffer a second injury and have a significant brain injury, typically fatal. There's still not really great data that this second impact syndrome actually exists, but it really was what spurred some of the first national attempts at looking at concussion guidelines. It was what was called the Colorado rules, and that was around the same time that Dr. Cantu was putting his guidelines together. Another 10 years forward was my my second year in Eugene. And at that time, it was just an emerging issue. In fact, I didn't come to town thinking I was going to have a significant concussion practice. The concussion practice kind of found me because the athletic trainers were seemingly getting more of these kids. And primary care physicians were, as many of you know, were not overly comfortable managing them. So it just kind of became more and more my thing. So what have I learned from those books, and what did I learn from 30 years of practice? Knowledge changes. We know a lot more than we used to know, but we still don't know very much. And you do what you know. If things work, if you know what you're doing, and if you certainly pay attention to what you don't know, you can make a better path forward, and you accept those things that you don't know. You don't try and make them up. You don't try and skirt the issue. You accept that it's something that you don't know, and you move forward. This is kind of in my way.
Yeah, you can move it.
There we go. I should be able to figure it out though, huh? So concussion management in 2017, recognize the injury and manage it properly from the beginning is key, as you all know. We're also learning more and more that pre-existing anxiety or other mental health issues coupled with poor psychosocial supports are going to usually lead to what I describe as a bad outcome, meaning that are we going to get this kid better, or is it just going to take a really, really long time? I can kind of consider both of those bad outcomes. And I really think that it's rare to see prolonged symptoms staying greater than 3 months in kids that don't have some pre-existing mental health pathology, and I'm convinced of that more and more on a daily basis. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you some statistics. You guys probably haven't seen a lot of this before, so this is kind of interesting. So this is from a friend of mine, Dawn Comstock. She is on our National Federation of High School Sports Medicine Advisory Committee as a member, and she is at Colorado School of Public Health. She's an epidemiologist. She's put together the best high school injury data that we have on everything, and particularly on concussion. So if you look at this, this is football since 2005, 2006. So what this shows us is it shows us the top is injuries in competition. The bottom line here is in practice, and then the middle is overall. So first of all, which many of you probably do know, but here it's obvious, we see a lot more concussions in practice, in competitions for football than we do in practice. And that's basically the same for all sports. I don't have the data here in front of you. The other thing I want you to take a look at is where that line goes: 2007, 2008, 2008, 2009, boom, boom, goes up, goes up. Around 2008, 2009, as many of you remember, was really when we were first starting to nationally talk about this. This is also around the time that Washington and Oregon put their concussion laws into place, and also around the time that the National Federation of High Schools changed the rule in the rules book, where officials were tasked with recognizing signs, symptoms, and behavior of concussion and sending those kids to the sidelines if those should occur. That rule change really spurred a lot of education amongst coaches, officials, and folks in the schools. So if you appreciate that, and then you can see that it's kind of leveled out. So what I'm sure you all suspect, and what pretty much all of us think, is that we didn't see a true increase in concussion incidents over that time. We saw an increase in concussion recognition over that time. So these are the kids that were just getting missed before, is certainly the most likely thing.
You have to click the.
Oops.
There you go.
There we go. Here's another one for you. This looks at it a little bit differently. So 8 consecutive years of increasing concussion rates, decreased from 2013, 2014, 15, and then came up a little bit. Follows what it is over time. An AE is an athletic exposure. An athletic exposure is one athlete participating in one practice or competition. So those obviously build up over time. You have 50 kids on a football team. That's going to build up with weekly practices and weekly games. To level out, so you are comparing apples and apples, you can take a look at what those what those athletic exposures and concussion rates are in other sports. So with football, most recent data that we have here, 10.5. Ice hockey, 7.6. Wrestling, boys lacrosse, boys soccer. Look at that girls soccer number, 9.1 compared to 10.5. Now, there's certainly a concern with football of these subconcussive blows, but when we look at just overall, football gets a really bad rap. Girls soccer still doesn't get that bad of a rap in the popular press. And the thing that I really want you to think about that is for football. Football season lasts from the end of August, typically through the end of October or mid-November, and then the boys are done playing football. Many of you know that girls' soccer season never ends. It goes on and on and on. So if it's 9.1 injuries per 10,000 athletic exposures in girls' soccer, 10.5 for boys in football, how many more exposures do you think girls have over the course of a year playing soccer than boys have playing football?
Especially given that many of these girls have 2 and 3 practices a day or 2 and 3 games a day.
Exactly. And then we stir into the pot, although beyond our subject here, incidence of ACL injury in high school is roughly 1.2 per 10,000, so much lower than what it is concussion, but still, when you look at all those that add up quickly, a significant injury. So what's going on? More concussions being recognized? Well, yeah, we think that's the case. But, some of these kids, we're just not going to miss them because they have significant ongoing problems. So what other factors are involved? And one of those factors may very well be anxiety and depression. That's certainly becoming more and more my bias as time goes on. If you look, there's from a study here, National Trends in Prevalence and Treatment of Depression in Adolescents. MDE is a major depressive episode. Females 12 to 20, it's went up incidence from 8.7 to 11.3 in 2014. I'm reading a fascinating book right now that I can't remember the long title about, but it's about the I generation. And the researcher has followed depression and anxiety and other factors over time. And 2012 is an incredible marker when she looks at all of her data for the poor well-being of teenagers in the United States. increased anxiety. The suicide rate is now higher than the homicide rate for the first time in 30 years. Huge amounts of pathology in our teenagers that start about 2012. Guess what else happened in 2012? Greater than 50% of the population owned a smartphone in 2012. So I will try and find the exact title of that book in a little bit and let you all know, because it's really good, especially for those of you who have teenagers. And
We can send it out.
I
You
have
the
three
list
of them.
everybody. Click on that. Yeah. There you go.
So one of the things we're looking at in concussion, and I think probably the biggest thing that you're going to start to see changing in the school setting when you're dealing with these kids is really trying to shift what we're doing with them, not academically so much, but physically. There was an article by DeFazio out of Pittsburgh in 2015 talking about prolonged activity restrictions and are we actually worsening outcomes, and trying to redefine rest. So back in several years ago, we really were big on the don't do anything, stay quiet, don't move around, don't go out, don't do anything. And the worry is that we may have induced some issues. There's this thing called the nocebo effect, which is the causation of sickness by the expectation of sickness. So when these kids hear about how bad a concussion is, and then we shut them down, friends and family and physical activity and their social life and all can be a significant stressor on them. And we really worry that we could actually be causing some pathology. Now, I'm not saying that these kids should go about normal life and they don't need any restrictions, but it's really more about balance. So both from a mental health standpoint and then from the physical side of just deconditioning. You get these kids who are active 23 hours a day, and then we try and shut them down and wonder why they're tired and depressed and not sleeping well. So yeah, this is hard to move forward because everything that I just talked about is really gray. And it's difficult to do gray in populations that we're dealing with a lot of folks who are involved, teachers, parents, teachers, counselors. So that's going to be one of the reasons it was difficult to get where we're going. When I first started doing this concussion part, it was difficult to get people to understand that you needed to do anything from an academic situation. Now I have people who will come in and they've seen their primary care physician, they're 3 weeks out from an injury, and I'll say, how's school going? And they'll say, well, I haven't been in 3 weeks. Uh-oh. So we need to reverse much of what we've been saying over the last few years. So rest, but not too much, active, but not too active, school accommodations, and really trying not to miss too much time and trying to normalize activities as much as possible with friends and with teammates and with family, but also still maintaining the need to decrease risk for re-injury. So many of you may be familiar with this approach, and this is certainly one of the things that are changing, why you all are involved as we are moving forward. And trying to do more of this is this collaborative care approach. So cognitive behavioral therapy was embedded in a team treatment model. They did this up in Seattle. They randomized the trial at 1 month of symptoms. And 6 months after baseline, 13% in the intervention group had high levels of symptoms, and 41% had high levels of symptoms in the control group. So still kind of sad and worrisome that 13%, even in the treatment group, were still having issues 7 months out from injury, but clearly better than seeing almost half of them. So this, again, McCarty Pediatrics, and we can send out that article too if you haven't already.
Did you send that to us?
I don't think so.
Okay, yeah, if you send that to us, we'll send it out.
So we can get that to you. But again, looking more at that team approach. The difficulty, of course, is the team approach is hard depending upon where you are and what resources you have. But doing the best we can is clearly how we want to move forward. So you all know concussion team. I won't read that off for you, but clearly having as many of those folks on board and involved. And some schools are not going to have those people. Some areas and regions are not going to have all those people. But trying to work in a collaborative manner, even if you have to reach out to some folks who are, a few miles away, can be helpful. One of the things that we're talking more and more about is kind of who needs to see a concussion specialist and when they should get in. So again, in Oregon, we're a little limited in doing this. So when we look at concussion specialists, we're probably only looking at Eugene, Portland, and Bend as our major areas where the folks are available. So this is not going to be possible everywhere, but trying to build those teams to at least you can look to guidance from some people if you can't bring them all on board.
I would say too, because we have people from other states on that. In most states, that's the how it is. Near your major cities is where you're going to find your concussion specialists, and the folks that are in more rural settings. We're going to have a more difficult time.
Exactly.
It's that way across the country.
Yeah, so that's why it's going to be important to try and form those teams. And you may be in an area where there is somebody who's not necessarily a quote-unquote specialist, but you may find a pediatrician or a family medicine doctor who has taken more of a special interest in it, and then may have those contacts at the either the medical center or at a larger clinic nearby. So the ones we're really looking at trying to get involved with this are if there's a complicated or prolonged course, the risk factors for complicated or prolonged course, such as symptoms longer than 2 weeks, you probably stretch that out to 4 weeks, but at least start thinking about getting the ball rolling at the 2-week mark. Vestibular symptoms, so dizziness, fogginess, those are the things that we want to be looking at. Pre-existing anxiety and depression, without a doubt. Prior concussion in the previous 6 months, previous complicated concussion. So if they had a prolonged course previously or multiple concussions, the kids who have had 3 or 4. Now that multiple concussion kid may not be quite as important to get him in to be seen right away, but if it's someone who's looking at returning to sports, they deserve a discussion with somebody who does this on a regular basis. Obviously, if the provider or parent requests, and then there are some clinical indicators and some impact testing predictors as well that can be helpful in looking at that potential for prolonged course.
So Sue Hayes, she's our liaison from Central Oregon in the Bend-Redmond area. She just put in the comments, for those of you who didn't see, that school nurses are often incredibly key if your school has access to them for the concussion teams. Here in Oregon, it varies from week to week and day to day, but about half of our schools have school nurses, and that's different from state to state, just depending on funding. But we are finding that the school nurses can play a really strong role on that team, and in fact take some leadership roles. So if you have school nurses, make sure you include them in your teams to manage concussion.
Definitely. And if you're fortunate enough to have both an athletic trainer and a school nurse, you really want them working on the same page as much as possible. And that's one of the things in Oregon that we've tried to do is to get them working, because concussion is far from the only area that they're going to be working together on, but can be really exceptionally helpful in that case. So for those of you who are familiar with impact testing, it's a computerized neuropsych test. It's not perfect, and not everybody has it, so it's not available to everyone. In Oregon, we have the Oregon School Activities Association has offered it at a reduced cost to all schools. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how many schools are currently utilizing it. The reason I bring it up for this discussion is not so much for return to play issues, but looking at sensitivities for predicting prolonged course. So you can see here the cutoff values of impact at 2 days post-injury that predict a protracted recovery, and their definition of protracted recovery here is approximately a month. So those are something to look at if you happen to get your hands on that test early on, or if you know that the athletic trainers are looking at it, or other folks within the school. Those are the numbers that can be really helpful. So if the kids are doing poorly on it, there's somebody that you know they've got a good chance of being several weeks in the process of taking to get better. Also, there was a study done in pediatrics looking at athletes who were not removed to play at the time of injury. So, obviously our mantra to kids over and over is If you get concussion symptoms during a game or a practice, you need to come out. You need to come out. So this was a study done University of Pittsburgh where they looked at kids who were injured during a game and admitted that they continued to play despite symptoms. And you can see almost six times more likely to have a protracted recovery here. They're saying protracted recovery greater than 21 days. But another indicator, not a perfect predictor, but certainly an indicator of this one may last a little bit longer. And then here's a very busy slide, but there's some interesting things to take away from it. And that's on-field markers and symptoms predicting, again, 3 weeks or longer recovery. And you can see the big one there is dizziness. So if at the time of injury, the injured athlete reports that, yeah, got hit and I was dizzy, and it's not a physical exam finding that someone's looking at, it's just that report of dizziness, they were almost 7 times as likely to have symptoms lasting greater than 3 weeks. Interestingly, if you look at the ones highlighted in yellow, those show that loss of consciousness and vomiting actually may be somewhat protective, so to speak. That those were less likely to have a prolonged course. And we're not exactly sure why. There has been in the past the thought that kind of obvious signs of concussion make people treat them differently, make sure that they're out of the game, make sure that they're in a quiet spot. That's hard to say. It may just be different parts of the brain that are injured, different effects. The dizziness one clearly is affecting the vestibular system, and we're seeing more and more that vestibular system injury tends to take a little bit longer. So I don't know what to make of the protective effects of loss of consciousness and vomiting, but clearly the dizziness is one that we need to look at. And again, this is just a little bit different look at that same data. So as you all know, when we look at concussion, there's not a ton of evidence-based medicine out there. We don't have lots and lots of long-term studies that we can look at. We don't have lots and lots of randomized control data. So a lot of this is really looking at more from a standpoint of best practices, expert consensus, but then really just trying to sprinkle the studies in that are there. So this 5th International Conference on Concussion in Sport was done in October of 2016. And they came up with some recommendations that should be done. So this was an international group who meets usually about every 3 to 4 years, and this is obviously the 5th time. So some of the things that you may hear about in the school setting, thought that it would be good for you to hear about here. One of these things is that the sensor systems that people talk about, so using an accelerometer that's in a helmet or a patch that goes behind the ear or goes into a mouthpiece or goes into a or goes into a chin strap football. Those sensor systems are not supported by really any data at this time. So just because an accelerometer says that a 90 G force happened, there's no data that says that that's an increased risk for concussion. So using those systems and an alarm goes off and you go and check number 25 because his alarm just went off, there's no basis for doing that. Baseline testing, such as impact that I talked about, or other type of baseline testing, pencil and paper testing of kids preseason is not required at this time. People can certainly use it if they have the resources available. And many of us do recommend doing it. Again, if you have the bodies and the money available to do it, it's not super expensive and it can be very handy. But it's not it's essentially not, standard of care at this time. Brief period of complete rest is what was discussed in this document. The goal is really trying to get kids back to school in 2 or 3 days. Longer than that, even despite what their symptoms are, it seems like it's very difficult to get them back after that and really start running into problems.
And it increases their risk of academic failure the longer they're out.
And particularly some schools where if the kids miss 5 days or whatever,
10-day
then
drop
they
schools.
they get disenrolled. Multidisciplinary treatment plan, which includes sub-symptom threshold, sub-maximal exercise. So that's obviously a fancy way of saying get them moving even before symptom resolution. And again, that's a change. That's a change in treatment. We used to talk about no activity until they start, until their symptoms are resolved. And that's really something that, even if we look at some of the handouts that we use, we need to start reviewing those because there are some of our return to play and guidelines, and even some of the things that schools have put into place as far as their protocols talk about this concept of complete rest, no exercise prior to symptom resolution. So that's something that we need to look at changing. You need to look and see what your protocols look like. Severity of initial symptoms is the most consistent predictor of slow recovery, greater than about 4 weeks. Migraine history, mental health history are included as well. Again, we talked about some of those impact findings and others that certainly go along with this, but this group most strongly endorsed these two issues. Clearly, you all know this one. It was nice to have that in the document, though, that schools are encouraged to have a sports-related concussion protocol.
So Scott Perry is asking about thoughts on using autonomic monitoring intensity. Is that what that says?
Yeah, so question about how do you monitor symptoms, how do you monitor heart rate, breathing rate, things like that as they return to activity. I think it really depends upon what your resources are. You can do a lot. There is certainly research done looking at heart rate, looking at beat-to-beat variability in heart rate when you start exercising again. But that's just beyond the vast majority of the kids that we're going to be working with. If you've got an athletic trainer, if you've got the equipment available, there's some neat things that you can do. If you're near a research center that's working on that, there's some interesting stuff. When it comes to the majority of kids that we're dealing with, I deal with in clinic, I just want them out walking, going for a walk for 15, 20 minutes, try and do it once a day or try and do it twice a day. Don't get your heart, basically don't go fast enough or hard enough that you feel your heartbeat going faster or that you're sweating. And then slowly we start increasing activity after their symptoms resolve. Again, there's a lot that can be done in more of a research setting, or if you've got some different monitoring equipment available, but really just trying to keep it simple for the majority of the population. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the cause and effect relationship has not been demonstrated between CTE and sports-related concussion or exposure to contact sports. And then we have very limited data on prevention. Best data that we have is some rules changes that they've made in youth hockey, but really nothing else out there. We talked about soccer before. We talked about ACL risk, and I talked about that absolute risk and looking at exposure. People also ask about headers. It's really the act of attempting heading, collisions and falling. The ball to the head injuries are pretty rare with intentional heading. The ball to head injuries that I see are when the kids either don't see the ball coming and don't have time to react, or if they get distracted, something happens while they're going to head and they're not ready for it, they're not braced. There's been a lot of data looking at the act of heading and causing concussion. There's not any great studies that show that there's a problem. There certainly are some adaptive changes, we think, from the ball heading. Stronger your neck, the better. But again, there's no consistent data that shows there's long-term issues dealing with heading. There's some studies that aren't particularly well done that suggest there may be some issues, but that's really a work in progress. So many of you may have seen this article a few months ago in the New York Times, where the researchers looked at NFL players' brains and saw lots and lots of CTE, also saw it in some college players and even some former high school players. The biggest answer right now on CTE is that we just don't know. CTE is a tauopathy, meaning that it's this abnormal tau protein. It's accumulation of the microtubule associated protein. And it's not just found in CTE, it's found in a ton of different things. Alzheimer's, Down syndrome, CTE, dementia, Pick's disease, and these other neurologic causes plus or neurologic issues plus some other things. I am no expert when it comes to this, so I'm just kind of going by some of the reading that I've done. But it's pretty unknown at this point what exactly is going on. The tau accumulation is typically an age-dependent process. Traumatic brain injuries early in life may also induce or expedite it. This isn't brand new. Punch-drunk boxers or pugilistic dementia was known for decades prior to this, and it's the same issue in those boxers. And it's a protein that binds those microtubules, so there's probably some role in stabilization. So, it's one of those things that some of that tau deposition could potentially be adaptive to begin with and then become pathologic after it reaches a certain state. There's certainly going to be some genetic factors involved, I would think, but we also don't know about other exposures as well, such as steroids, drugs, alcohol, and other issues. So again, a lot that we just don't know. So this, of course, has led to this concern, articles like this. There are some longer-term data that's come out. This is looking at in the population of people who played high school football in the 50s and 60s. There was no increased risk late in life of neurodegenerative issues. This study was also done in Wisconsin, same sort of thing, looking at people who played in the 50s and 60s with no long-term issues. Again, football was a different sport back in those days. People weren't as big, weren't as fast, you can argue, but still, we also know that concussion was definitely not being talked about or really worried about in those days as well. So to circle back, looking more at concussion, the more I look at this model, the more I like it. I always tell people that no two concussions are created equal, and there's a lot of different clinical trajectories. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. We look at the cognitive fatigue, vestibular, ocular, post-traumatic migraine, cervical, anxiety, and mood. A lot of these mix together. Rarely do we just see one, but you can certainly appreciate all of the different types of concussion that can be seen and how the response is going to be to that, how academic accommodations may play more of a role in some, whereas we may be looking more at physical therapy, we may be looking more at exercise and counseling intervention with others.
Is there any of these symptoms or results of concussion that you see more frequently?
I tend to see the cognitive fatigue, the vestibular, and the anxiety and mood are the most common. Vestibular and anxiety, there is a gigantic interplay between those two that I don't completely understand at this point in time. I think those two play off each other, but those are the ones that
play together.
That send us down the road to trouble when we've got the anxiety issue with the vestibular.
Are you seeing an increase in ocular? And I'm asking because in my role as a TBI person for Oregon, I've seen more and more kids with. And I'm just wondering if you're seeing that as well.
Yeah, so ocular is really difficult. Ocular can have a pretty significant vestibular component. Ocular is hard for me, and I can now make my controversial comment. Ocular is difficult to figure out because I've never sent anyone for a vision evaluation who hasn't been diagnosed and told that they need to have vision therapy. So it's really difficult to sort that out. And if you talk to other concussion centers, you get the same answer. I know at Pittsburgh, they admit the fact that they went through several different optometrists until they found somebody that they really thought was on top of things. So yeah, it's not easy. I have a difficult time with that one.
And it's hard to play out if there's a pre-existing vision issue as well. That was exacerbated by the concussion.
Yeah,
yes.
So that one's a little bit of a black box for me. But I have found that vestibular therapy seems to help.
alleviate some of
Yeah.
that.
So the other difficulty in concussion is what's better, and how do we assess what's healed? It's not like orthopedics where I can take x-rays and press you where you hurt. So we have to look at a variety of things, and you all know this. When we look at prevention, again, I talked about earlier that there's some rules changes in youth hockey. We just don't have the data for prevention yet. Got a concussion or a soccer full 90 there. There's actually a study being done in Wisconsin on these right now, which is going to be really interesting to see what the results are, whether the soccer headgear decreases concussion. This right here is a new football helmet called the Visus. It's a little different build. It's got a little bit more give to it. That's being used in some NFL teams and some college teams. It's a heavy helmet. That's the problem with it. So people have not been liking it very much. It's not a high school helmet at this point in time because I think, if I remember right, they're about $2,000. This Rydell helmet right here is a precision fit. They take a picture of your head and then do a 3D fit for the inside of it. That's around $1,600. No study has yet shown that one type of helmet is protective for concussion versus other. I've got a mouthpiece down there. No proven effect that that's going to benefit you and decrease risk of concussion. So I'm going to, since it's football season and I've already harshed on soccer, I just have to talk about football a little bit. So that muddy young man there is my son from his final game last year. So yes, I did let my son play football. Football is, as you can imagine, in for some difficult times. I can primarily speak to the state of Oregon. Participation is down about 10 to 15% from 2008. We had a state summit in April led by the High School State Association. We brought 70 youth football leaders from across the state together to talk about what we can do to help this sport out, both from a safety standpoint and from a participation standpoint. Really looking at it as community programs. We're having problems statewide because we've got schools that have 1,500 kids and they've only got 30 or 40 kids on their football team. So really looking at what we have to do from a participation standpoint, changing classifications, allowing schools to classify down just for football to try and keep viable sports programs, because many of us feel that football has some very positive benefits. And as long as we can make it as safe as possible. It's also difficult to sort out why those participation numbers are dropping. Participation numbers are dropping in wrestling as well, and wrestling doesn't have a huge concussion cloud hanging over it. Talked about this generation of kids and how things are changing. It may just be that it's becoming increasingly difficult to convince boys to get away from their video games and air conditioning to go out, get yelled at, sweat, and hurt each other for a few hours on end. But certainly those numbers are dropping. USA Football has been started as a educational model to try and improve the youth sports side of things. High schools have a good governing body because there's a national overseeing organization, plus each state looks at safety issues. Youth football doesn't have that. Pop Warner, people think about it as kind of being the little league of football, but it's really not. I think there's only 6% of youth football programs in the nation are part of Pop Warner. So USA Football is trying to kind of fill that void, and they are clearly a propaganda arm of the NFL, and that's accepted. But it doesn't mean what they're not trying is a good thing. So they have these protocols in place for concussion, heat, and hydration. They put in contact restrictions, safe blocking and tackling. And the high schools and USA Football have again been working together to try and implement some of the safety things on both sides. So it's a common approach from the ground up. And then this is just something for all of you to look at from safety standpoint, for whether it's football or soccer. If you're involved in your communities, this is just a little safety checklist. And this is my son, again, number 51, with his little brother. So probably not going to be a football player, but we'll see. He's a little slight. I was joking with my wife that maybe he'll wrestle and he'll be one of those 100-pound freshman who does really well, but he'll also probably be one of those 100-pound seniors that do really well. His sisters think he's going to be a cheerleader, and they're thinking that he's probably at this point going to be a flyer, but we'll see. So emergency action plan should always be in place. Lightning, AEDs, concussion policy, athlete and parent education, return to play protocols, injury policy, including notes for return to play, athletic trainers for game coverage, and some sort of medical advisor. So again, whether it's your school program or whether it's your community program, those are things to have in place. And then, of course, what several people think we should do is outlaw high school football. What's going to happen if we outlaw high school football tomorrow? We're going to have club football the next day, and club soccer, club basketball, club volleyball have limited safety protocols, and they are making money instead of worrying about safety. So I would be very, very wary of moves to outlaw high school football. So that ends it. We're open to questions. And this is one of my favorite pictures from my son's team from last year. That is my cell phone number and my email. If you have any questions that come up, whether it's regarding this presentation or wherever you are across the country, if you've got a difficult case, looking for a physician, looking for some help, I can help point you to those resources. If you're not in Oregon, looking to perhaps try and work with your state high school association on some things, I can point you in the direction of those folks. And again, open to questions on topics today, but feel free again to contact me on anything in the future.
And I'm going to stop recording there so we can ask questions. For those of you who do watch the webinar in the future, the same goes out to all of you. Please email Dr. Keister or myself at Siebert asking any of those questions you may have.